Hi friends, so today we're talking about the biggest roadblocks you're likely to run into as a beginner watercolorist, especially if you're learning this on your own without a professional guidance. These are the challenges that occurred to me over and over when I first started, but also these days I see so commonly occurring in our classroom setting. So the chances are you are frustrated with them, but you're not sure what's happening and what you can do to overcome that. So let's talk all about that in today's video. Here's a heads up that this video is the third of the full series for watercolor beginners with a focus on helping you jumpstart your watercolor practice. So if you haven't watched the previous two videos that talks about the supplies, the basic washes, as well as mini scenes ideas that you can use to expand your skills quickly, then make sure to go check out these two videos here. All right, moving us on. The first, but also the biggest roadblock you're going to encounter as a beginner is the feeling that you don't have full control over the medium and it is behaving in a way that you do not intend it to be. This usually manifests itself as things like bumpy, unsmooth wash, overworked or staining surfaces, unintended white spots on the border of your shapes, and maybe the shapes itself feels wobbly and timid. There's a whole host of reasons why this type of undesired outcome happens. So I'm gonna break down this big category of medium control into three specific areas: light, mid, and dark tone wash. For the light wash, the most common frustration is not being able to achieve a really smooth wash. Now, there can be several reasons that leads to this uneven wash. The first being just not saturating your brush evenly with the same consistency and color. I see often beginners use only the tip of their brush, don't even touch the bottom of the water jug. They just swish their brush around with the tippy top of it. And when they're mixing, they're only mixing the tip of the brush. So then when you apply this to the paper, you will notice that the tip of the brush has stronger color than the belly of it. And the second reason for this is you're using the wrong brush. If you use something like this is a high quality synthetic brush. It's good for applying details and dark tones, but it's just not made for applying light wash. This fiber is much more firm and it does not absorb a lot of water. So when you try to mix with this brush, even though your paint consistency is correct and watery, because this brush itself runs out of the paint so fast. So between all of those dipping, reloading, you're not only extending the time you have to execute this area, you're also risking each load of the paint result in a different paint consistency and amount of paint so that the entire area is not even. And the third common mistake here is not having enough paint. So you may have just a little bit of paint before you get started painting, only to realize after one application, you already run out of the mixture. So when you try to mix some new paint, while everything is drying up so quickly on the paper, when you come back to it, you inevitably introduce very different consistencies to the painting surface so that these two will not intermingle nicely. And the beginner's tendency is that your subsequent mixtures of the paint tend to be either darker or more watery than the initial one, so that it may create some staining effect. Other times may have big blotches of color that's not intended. So to overcome these bumpy washes, your goal is again to fully load your brush. Dab the brush at the bottom of the water jug so it's fully saturated with water. Scoop some water into your palette and then intensify that puddle by adding in pigment. And while you mix that puddle, press down your brush as well so that the belly of your brush is saturated with the same color. And then judge the puddle size to the area you're going to paint and make sure there is sufficient pigment that will cover the entire area. And then, only then, you go in and apply this wash evenly and smoothly. And remember to use a quill brush. not a bristle brush that has rigid fibers. And here's a reminder that I'll be doing a beginner watercolor bootcamp through my Patreon program in January and February of 2026, where I invite you to take a 30-day challenge, painting 30 miniature scenes, not based on photo, but really help you expand the visual vocabulary of different subjects while enhancing your core skills from controlling the wash, building color, and judging the tonal range. If you want to sign up or learn more, check out the link here or in the description. Now let's talk about mid-tone wash and the issues associated with this step, which is typically related to stainy or overworked surfaces. The first issue is having kind of like a wobbly shape. Now, the challenging part about mid-tone as compared to light tone is that we now have to create shapes and certainly to avoid certain shapes as we paint. So very commonly, your beginner's tendency is that you're so careful about not overrunning any of the drawing outlines that you're painting very slowly. The slower you move your brush, the more wobbly your line will be. So here, the areas where the greeneries meet the buildings should have a straight line of a roof, ended up being a very wobbly shape. So it really doesn't look like the subject anymore. And another thing I see that often happens is that you ended up with this white space around your drawing outlines and in the middle of the wash. Even after you have finished painting the entire scene, these white borders and little speckles of whites are really a distraction. So the common misconception here is that the slower you work, the more precise your shape will be. And actually the opposite is true. All right, before I go ahead and show you the right way to paint it, let's first go through the remaining common mistakes. The second one being, again, using the wrong brush. So even though this is a cream consistency, then the watery tea consistency for the light wash, you still need very rich and thick paint mixtures. And oftentimes the speed of applying the area all in one go really matters. And know this, for watercolor, the wetter your area is, the bigger of a window you have to actually make things right. If you start out with a dry mixture, you're basically shutting that window down right away. The surface is no longer liquid and therefore no longer live, where you can continue to push the boundaries or move paint around. And another thing I often see people do in this step is that they feel like the color is not intense enough after the initial application. So they're going to go back and add more pigment to the area. This is where the overworking look really starts to show up because the bottom layer has already dried. The bumpiness is going to show through no matter what. So even with the cream consistency, that it's thicker and it feels like it's going to cover up your mistake, it still is not. You will still need to aim for finishing painting that entire shape all in one application with a rich, wet, and creamy consistency. The third most common issue with the mid-tone wash is, again, your consistency is not dark enough. This can also lead to overworking and stainy effect. Is when the initial layer is not dark enough, it's not creating enough contrast as compared to the light tone wash. The light of your subject literally will not come out. So oftentimes people will go back and apply another layer on top of that wash. And now you guessed it, it will either turn out to be stainy or overworked. It will have this effect where you can see multiple shapes overlapping on top of each other with each of the underlayer shown through. And that does not spell confidence. Not to mention you're introducing twice or triple the amount of work for yourself. Paint any given shape. Now let's see what the right consistency looks like for this. First, we need to really pay attention to the movement and the outline of your shape. And start with carving out the outline confidently and quickly with just one attempt using the tip of your brush. Now you can color in the remaining of the shape using the belly of your wash, where it has more pigment and can apply larger areas quickly. And that's how you can create a clean shape and also quickly fill up that shape so that it doesn't have these white speckles. Like here, I'm carving out the outline of the mountain using the tip of the brush, but also using the same method to carve out the top of the buildings. And you'll be better off to fill up the shapes a little bit bigger than the pencil drawing, than not going all the way to fill the shapes and leave out these white outlines around your shape. And then fill up these bigger gaps in between, then work my way down. So then when this area dries up, it will look smooth, and it also offers enough contrast compared to the light tone layer. Okay, so let's talk about the dark tone wash and what can possibly go wrong with that. Now for the dark tone wash, the most common issue is actually not have that dark enough of a value showing through, and oftentimes it's also combined with more timid or wobbly brush strokes, and maybe there's not enough dry brush mark showing through as desired. When working with the dark tone, this is the time you do want to use a more rigid fiber brush like a synthetic round, and make sure you create energetic brush strokes. However, the challenging part about the dark wash is that the energy of your brush stroke will show through very obviously, so that there's nowhere to hide, which is a super common issue with beginners. Your wobbly brush stroke will appear very obviously against the light background. You'll be better off try to emulate the same shape, just using very brief brush stroke and do it quickly. I will show you how to do that in the end, but here is an example for when you're being too timid or slow about moving your brush. And as a beginner, you're also tempted to color in the shapes exactly as you have drawn. So here for the roof of the building, if I color that in exactly, then I end up with these white borders around the roof. These white spots don't represent anything in real life, and therefore they are a really big distraction and create that amateur look for your painting. Now, the second very common mistake is, again, working with not thick enough paint for the dark tone. And in a part 1 of this video series, I talked about the struggle of going dark when working with dry watercolors. So here's a more concrete example. You're really trying to scrub every single paint from that dry pan, but still the color is not dark enough. And if you go in with a very weak mixture, you will feel like not enough contrast compared to the mid-tone wash. Again, remember, without dark, there is no light. So if you want your scene to come into life in their three-dimensional forms, you cannot hold back in terms of going darker. Now, the third common mistake is actually using too much moisture for the dark tone. So the dark tone usually is thick, but it also should be relatively dry so that you can create richer texture like dry brush marks. This is where you want to use the rigid synthetic round brush as compared to the quill. If I go in and use quill, you'll see that it's actually harder to keep the mixture thick and dry. So it's harder to control the lines, especially if you're working very slowly. When it dries up, this mixture does not have enough intensity compared to the mid-tone again. Then, last but not least, let's look at how we can overcome it. First, again, the speed of application really matters. Think before you apply, rather than start applying and then realizing you're painting the wrong shape. So notice the overall movement and then go in confidently. You see here, just a few brief horizontal strokes is all it needs to depict the land where it meets the water. Sometimes relieve the pressure you put onto the paper to create these tapered shapes and almost like broken lines. They will make your artwork feel more vivid and dynamic. You don't have to follow the outline of your drawing really. The drawing is there to guide the overall movement of your brush. And for the roofs, even though these seems to be very rigid geometric shapes, as long as you conform to the overall movement of this shape, you can ignore your drawing pretty much, but still be able to suggest your subject by roughly conforming to the movement of these shapes. Alright guys, so I did spend a lot of time on this first roadblock, which is related to lacking control over the watercolor medium. These are really at the root cause of a lot of the issues that beginners face. So it's really worthwhile to get to the bottom of it, fully understand what happened and why, before you move on to think about colors, composition, and expression. Alright, so let's move on to the second likely roadblock you're going to encounter, which is all about painting shapes. So what creates that amateur or childish feeling of your work as a beginner is usually due to this reason, is that you're not painting by shapes. You're still confining your shape within individual objects. So you're deploying more of a coloring book method to watercolor painting, and that would not lead to artistic results. To give you a more concrete example here, we have a scene of the street with the buildings, trees, and a car. So most people, when they start practicing art, they would treat these individual buildings and the car and the road as separate objects, and they will paint it as such. So starting from the sky, and stop right before the building and the trees. And these buildings, if they look like different colors in the photo, then you will also be painting them literally these different colors like yellow, red, and white. The road is gray, and therefore you paint the road as gray. Now the issue with that is when you keep your wash strictly within these confined objects, you'll see that the scene really lacks cohesion. And typically I also notice many students would have these white borders because they're so afraid to exceed the outline of their object, try to not blend the color too much. And for the mid-tone layer, where we need to use thicker and darker tone for the shadow of these objects, the beginner's way of painting it will be that all the shadows are disjointed as well, and they will be of different colors. Say the red buildings will have a red shadow, the white building maybe have a gray color, and the yellow building has more of a yellow color. And they may also paint the shadow part of the car separately after you have painted all the cast shadows of the buildings on the ground. However, if you pay attention to a photo or in real life, the way the shadow works is that it actually unifies different objects and connects them. And there are many reflective surfaces and lights and tonal ranges within these shadows. They're not all of the same color. By painting the shadows individually for each object, you miss the opportunity to create that unified look. And also, it's really hard to keep these shadows vivid because you're sticking to just one color per surface. Now let's look at how a professional watercolorist would go about approaching the scene. They would start from the sky, but not really wait for the sky to dry up before they fill in the colors for the trees as well as the buildings, so that they're really blending all of the colors, even though these are separate objects. And they will go in and add maybe some red, yellow at parts of the subject, but not super concerned about needing to keep the yellow house strictly yellow, the red house strictly red. And even for the road, it's a cooler gray color. Doesn't hurt to also use some red and browns in it while adding some blues to create a bit of a gradation. And as the artist approached the second layer, the shadow shape, they will start with this rich saturated red color for the top of the buildings, that's red, but then slowly transition into a brown color and eventually into more of a gray-blue color for the shadows. Notice that we don't need to stop at all where one building starts and the other ends. We can also connect the color fully from the roof to the wall of the building as well without stopping. This way, the colors will bleed and blend and create a really luminescent feeling of the surfaces. But what creates even greater cohesion is when you also bring the shadows of the building onto the shadow of the road, connecting the two. and then further painting the shadow also on the side of the cars. So all of that shape are all connected, although they may have some varying hues in them to indicate a bit of separation between the object. But really together, they create this really strong, intense sunlight by the usage of the shadow shape. Remember, we talked about how important it is to really master the fundamentals of judging the paint consistency and practicing different combinations of paint consistency. And turns out this is exactly why we need to practice that, is when we're actually applying a connected shape across all of the object, but we need to join different colors within that shape. So if you're really good at judging paint consistency, you can quickly build the same consistency for different colors, and you can effortlessly transition between colors while still creating a bit of separation between these little details and surfaces within that shape. This is ultimately the reason why we need to practice paint consistency. We actually don't have to wait until the mid-tone to dry up here before we add in the dark tones for the windows and the wheels of the car. What it's going to create is even greater cohesion of this connected shadow shape as a whole. As versus here on the left side, if I go ahead and paint these window shapes, these repetitive shapes will stand out almost too much because the contrast against everything else is so high that you're actually downplay the cohesion of that connected shadow shape across all of the objects. And now we're going to talk about the issue of colors. It's basically rushing into using too many colors. The culprit, obviously, is because as beginners, you tend to collect so many colors and you're having a hard time not using them. But using so many colors without understanding the notion of the tonal range, that is really what's creating frustration and will tend to lead to a not cohesive color palette, but also a painting really lacking emphasis or focal point because there's not enough contrast. Color does not equal contrast, right? That's why I suggest you sticking to the primary colors only and think about colors just in terms of warm and cool. But at the same time, you need to pay extra attention. In fact, 80% of your attention should be paid towards how dark a particular shape is. And that is the notion of the value range. That's what creates the most contrast. And based on how dark the value is, then you choose the corresponding color as well as the thickness of the paint consistency to apply to that shape. Now, color cohesion is another typical struggle with beginners, but this one can actually be easily eliminated if you simply stick to the 3 muted primary colors that I have introduced you to start with, and then start using more vibrant, bright colors later on to help you push the 3 primary colors. If you rush into using these bright colors in your beautiful 24 watercolor set, then the likelihood these colors gonna jive together will become much lower. So when the color temperature don't jive, for example, then it will feel like these different subjects in the scene don't belong together in one space. So I would recommend really table the question of where do I use these bright colors to a later stage when you have actually solved the issues of the sufficient value and contrast, as well as really getting comfortable using these 3 muted primaries. But if you really want to know how to introduce brighter colors, I also have a masterclass on color mixing here that will show you different examples of actually pushing colors to intensify a specific mood or lighting. Although for right now, if you're just starting out watercolor, I would say that is a big distraction. All right, guys, we have covered a lot of different roadblocks and challenges you may encounter as a watercolor beginner. The 3 biggest roadblocks you're likely to encounter are feeling lack of control with the watercolor medium, focusing too much on painting the object, not the shapes, as well as using color to create a cohesive color palette for your painting without muddling things too much. So I would encourage you guys to just take a moment, look at some of the paintings you have done before, and hopefully you have tried painting the A miniature scenes that I have designed for you for beginners to supercharge your basic skills. So look at those paintings you have done. And if you notice any of the issues we have discussed today, try practicing on the side and painting that scene again and notice the differences for yourself. Alright guys, so for the next video, which is also the last of our beginner series, I would like to talk about the overall learning trajectory. So that will be the story of the evolution of a watercolor artist. What are really the big breakthrough moments and milestones you should be aiming for if you're just at the beginning of your journey. All right, so I look forward to chatting with you again in our next video. But for now, happy painting.